The rain fell in sheets, a cold, gray curtain that blurred the cheerful lights of the Northwood Galleria Mall into a watercolor smear. For the shoppers rushing from their cars to the automatic doors, it was an inconvenience, a reason to clutch their coats tighter and complain about the weather. For Arthur, it was a physical enemy. Each icy drop that found its way through the threadbare fabric of his army surplus jacket felt like a tiny, stinging defeat. He huddled in the shallow alcove just outside the main entrance, a space that offered the barest illusion of shelter. He wasn't begging, wasn't holding a sign, wasn't even making eye contact. He was simply trying to borrow a fraction of the warmth that spilled out every time the glass doors slid open. A wave of air that smelled of cinnamon pretzels and perfume, a scent from a world he no longer inhabited. His hands, chapped and blue with cold, were tucked under his arms. Pressed against his chest, beneath the layers of his worn flannel shirt and jacket, was a small, tightly folded American flag. The fabric was soft, almost delicate from age and handling, its edges frayed. It was his only possession of value, a relic of a promise made in a dust-choked land thousands of miles and a lifetime away. He was a ghost haunting the edge of plenty, his presence a silent, uncomfortable question that the bustling, happy people chose not to answer. They flowed around him like a river around a stone, their eyes fixed forward, their faces set in masks of determined indifference. A child might stare for a moment, his curiosity not yet smoothed over by adult propriety, before a parent would gently tug his hand and whisper, "Don't stare." Arthur had long ago stopped feeling the sting of their aversion. It was just a fact of his existence, like the cold or the hunger that gnawed at his belly. He was an obstacle, a problem, a piece of the urban landscape to be navigated and forgotten. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold brick, trying to find a quiet place in his mind where the rain couldn't reach. The reprieve was short-lived. A sharp rap on the glass beside his head made him flinch. He opened his eyes to see a young security guard standing on the other side of the door, his face a mask of pinched annoyance. The guard's uniform was crisp, his name tag mark gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He gestured impatiently with a thick, dismissive finger. "Move along." Arthur didn't move. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was on a public sidewalk, not blocking the entrance. He simply met the guard's gaze with a quiet stillness that seemed to infuriate the younger man even more. Mark's mouth tightened. He jabbed the button to open the doors and stepped out into the alcove, bringing with him a gust of that warm, pretzel-scented air that now felt like a taunt. "I'm not going to tell you again, old man," Mark said, his voice loud and carrying, designed for the audience of shoppers who were now slowing down to watch. "You can't loiter here. It's bad for business. Now get lost." The words were a dismissal of his entire being, reducing him to a piece of human refuse to be swept away. Arthur felt a familiar, weary ache settle in his chest, but he held his ground. Mark took another step forward, invading Arthur's personal space. The guard was younger, taller, and filled with the easy confidence of someone who had never known true hardship. He saw Arthur's worn clothes, his grizzled beard, his gaunt face, and saw nothing of the man within. He saw only a problem to be solved with force. "Are you deaf?" Mark sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I said, get out." Arthur slowly, deliberately, pushed himself away from the wall. His joints protested the movement, stiff from the cold. He looked the guard in the eye, his own gaze clear and steady despite the exhaustion that etched lines around them. "I'm just trying to get out of the rain for a minute," he said, his voice raspy from disuse but firm. "I'm not bothering anyone." This quiet dignity was a language Mark didn't understand. To him it was defiance. It was a challenge to his authority, an authority he wielded with the clumsy arrogance of the insecure. "You're bothering me," Mark snapped. "And you're bothering them." He gestured vaguely at the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and a faint, self-righteous disapproval aimed at Arthur. They were silent witnesses, their inaction a form of consent. With a grunt of frustration, Mark shoved Arthur hard in the chest. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a violent, demeaning act meant to assert dominance. The unexpected force sent Arthur stumbling backward. His worn boot heel caught on an uneven paving stone, and he went down, his hip cracking against the cold, wet concrete with a sickening thud. The contents of his jacket pocket spilled out. A half-eaten protein bar, a worn copy of a paperback, and the small, folded flag. The flag, his most sacred possession, landed with a soft, tragic splash in a dirty puddle of rainwater. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a faint and fleeting sound of shock, but no one moved. No one stepped forward. Mark looked down at Arthur, sprawled on the ground, a flicker of something. Perhaps surprise at his own brutality, crossing his face before it hardened again into a sneer. "That's what you get," he said, his voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. He turned and swaggered back inside the warm, dry mall, leaving Arthur to gather the scattered pieces of his dignity from the grimy pavement. The glass doors slid shut, sealing him back out in the cold. The world seemed to slow down. The sound of the rain, the distant traffic, the murmur of the crowd. It all faded into a dull roar in Arthur's ears. All he could see was the flag, lying in the puddle. The vibrant red and blue were muted, sinking into the murky water. He reached for it, his fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from a deep, profound wave of anguish. This wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a promise. It was the last tangible piece of Sergeant David Spike O'Connell. The memory rose, unbidden and sharp. Not the chaos of their final firefight, but the quiet, sterile grief of a military funeral back home. He remembered Spike's mother, a woman of impossible strength, pressing the perfectly folded triangle into his hands. Her eyes, red-rimmed but clear, had met his. "He said you were the best friend he ever had," she'd whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He'd want you to have this. He said you understood what it meant." Arthur had understood. The flag wasn't just for Spike. It was for all of them. It was for the ones who came home different and the ones who didn't come home at all. It was a symbol of a bond forged in dust and fear, a brotherhood that transcended blood. Spike had been different. He was loud, covered in tattoos, and rode a Harley that sounded like God clearing his throat. Before enlisting, he'd been a prospect for the Hells Angels, a life Arthur couldn't quite comprehend. But beneath the leather and the bravado was a core of unshakable loyalty. "My club, my core," Spike used to say with a grin. "Different patches, same brotherhood. You look out for your own," no matter what. That loyalty had cost Spike his life. He'd gone back for a fallen Marine under heavy fire, and Arthur had been right beside him. Arthur had made it back, dragging Spike's lifeless body. Spike hadn't. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to Arthur even on the sunniest days. After his discharge, the world he had fought for no longer seemed to have a place for him. The nightmares came, silent and suffocating. The sounds of the city became the crackle of gunfire. Crowds felt like closing walls. He lost his job as a mechanic because his hands would sometimes shake uncontrollably. His wife tried to understand, but his silence built a wall between them she couldn't climb. One day he came home to an empty apartment and a note on the kitchen table. He didn't blame her. How could you live with a ghost? He had drifted, from city to city, from shelter to shelter, the flag his only anchor in a sea of despair. It was his connection to the man he had been, to the honor he felt he had lost. Now, that last symbol lay desecrated in a puddle of urban filth, a mirror of his own life. He carefully lifted the flag from the water. The fabric was heavy, soaked through. The colors bled together, a sad, watery mess. He clutched it to his chest, the cold water seeping through his jacket, but he barely felt it. The cold inside him was far worse. He rose to his feet, his body screaming in protest. The small crowd of onlookers began to disperse, their moment of drama over. They returned to their shopping, to their warm, orderly lives, the image of the fallen man already fading from their minds. They had seen and they had done nothing. Their silence was a verdict. He was not one of them. He was not worthy of their help, not even of their sustained attention. Mark, The guard stood just inside the doors, arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face. He watched as Arthur, limping and shivering, made his way to a concrete bench just beyond the mall's overhang, fully exposed to the relentless downpour. Arthur sat down, his shoulders slumped. He unfolded the flag, the fabric heavy and dripping. He couldn't bear the thought of it being so soiled. He took off his own thin jacket, the only real barrier he had against the biting wind, and began to gently, painstakingly, dab at the flag, trying to absorb the dirty water, trying to clean it with the very thing he needed to survive. He was a solitary figure against the gray expanse of the parking lot, a portrait of quiet, desperate devotion. A woman hurried out of the mall, pulling a small girl by the hand. She was talking animatedly on her phone, her attention a million miles away. "No, Brenda. I told him if he wants the account, he needs to—" "Oh, hold on a second, sweetie." The little girl, no older than 6, wore a bright yellow raincoat and clutched a well-loved teddy bear. Distracted by a display of Christmas lights, she momentarily pulled her hand free from her mother's grasp. She skipped ahead, her boots splashing in the puddles. Arthur watched her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He remembered when his own daughter was that small, a fleeting memory of warmth in the vast coldness of his life. The girl didn't see the slick patch of oil mixed with rainwater on the asphalt near the crosswalk. Her boot hit it, and her feet went out from under her. She fell with a startled cry, landing hard on the pavement. Her teddy bear flew from her grasp, landing in the middle of the lane. At that exact moment, a large SUV, its driver oblivious, was making a turn into that very lane, its tires hissing on the wet road. The world snapped into sharp focus for Arthur. There was no thought, only instinct. The instinct of a soldier, a protector. He shoved himself off the bench, ignoring the searing pain in his hip. He moved with a speed that belied his haggard appearance, covering the distance in 3 long, limping strides. He reached the girl just as the SUV's headlights swept over her. Without hesitating, he placed himself between her and the oncoming vehicle, his body a shield. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching, the vehicle stopping just inches from him. A wave of dirty water from the tires drenched him, but he didn't flinch. He knelt down, his voice soft. "Are you okay, little one?" The girl was crying, more from shock than pain. He gently helped her to her feet, then walked into the path of the car to retrieve the soaked teddy bear. He squeezed some of the water out of it before handing it back to her. He brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her forehead. "There you go," he said, his smile genuine and kind. "He's a brave little bear." He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't wait for a reaction. His duty done, he turned to limp back to his bench and his sodden flag. The girl's mother finally ended her call, her face a mask of panic as she realized what had happened. She rushed over, scooping her daughter into her arms. Her first reaction was not gratitude, but suspicion. She looked at Arthur, this disheveled, homeless man who had just touched her child, and her features hardened. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, clutching her daughter protectively. But the little girl, safe in her mother's embrace, looked over her shoulder at Arthur. She wasn't afraid. She had seen not a threat, but a rescuer. In his tired eyes, she had seen kindness. "Mommy, he helped me," she said, her small voice clear and certain. "The soldier man saved my bear." She held up the damp toy as evidence. The mother paused, her accusation dying on her lips. She looked from her daughter's earnest face to Arthur, who was now sitting back on the bench, his attention once again focused on the stained flag. A flicker of shame crossed her face. A few other people who had witnessed the incident were now murmuring amongst themselves. The narrative was changing. The scary man had become the soldier man, the security guard. Mark watched from the doors, his expression souring. This act of selfless heroism was an inconvenience, complicating the simple, ugly picture he had painted. The shift was subtle at first, like a change in the wind. The whispers that had been tinged with fear and disgust were now colored with something else. Confusion, and perhaps a reluctant sliver of respect. "Did you see that? He just ran right out in front of that car," a woman said to her husband. "He saved her," the husband replied, his voice low with a dawning sense of awe. The mother, still holding her child, took a hesitant step toward Arthur. She fumbled in her purse and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here," she said, holding it out. "For your trouble." Arthur looked at the money, then up at her face. He saw her guilt, her attempt to transactionalize his compassion, to pay a debt and walk away clean. He slowly shook his head. "No, thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. "Just keep a closer eye on her." The refusal was more powerful than any acceptance could have been. It elevated his act from one of desperation to one of pure principle. He wasn't for sale. His dignity was not a commodity. The woman stood there for a moment, the $20 bill looking foolish and small in her hand. She finally stuffed it back in her purse, her cheeks flushed with a shame that was now undeniable. She gave Arthur a final, unreadable look before turning and leading her daughter away. The little girl looked back one last time and gave a small wave. Arthur, with a monumental effort, raised a hand and waved back. And then came the sound. It started as a low, guttural vibration. A tremor felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong in the sanitized, orderly world of the suburban mall. It grew steadily, a deep, syncopated rumble that seemed to shake the very air, drowning out the patter of the rain and the hum of traffic. Heads turned. Shoppers paused, their curiosity piqued. The sound was primal, menacing. It was the sound of rolling thunder on a clear day. One by one, they appeared at the far end of the parking lot. A single headlight cut through the gray mist, then another and another. They came in a staggered formation, a phalanx of chrome and black leather. Harley-Davidson motorcycles, dozens of them, their engines roaring in a defiant chorus. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, a river of steel and horsepower flowing into the lot. They were Hell's Angels. The patches on their leather vests, their cuts, were unmistakable. They were an invading army, their presence an immediate and profound disruption of the afternoon's commercial peace. They filled the parking rows closest to the entrance, 100 bikes arranged in perfect, intimidating lines. The engines cut out, one after another, the sudden silence almost as deafening as the previous noise. Men swung their legs over their bikes, their boots hitting the asphalt with solid, resonant thuds. They were large men, weathered and bearded, their faces hard, their eyes missing nothing. They stood by their machines, a silent, intimidating force, their collective gaze sweeping over the scene. The mall, the stunned onlookers, and the lone, shivering figure on the bench. A man detached himself from the group and began to walk toward the entrance. He was older than the rest, his long beard more gray than black, braided and tied with leather straps. He wore no helmet, and the rain slicked his hair back from a weathered, deeply lined face. He walked with a heavy, unhurried gait, the very picture of authority. This was their leader. The onlookers shrank back, some retreating into the safety of the mall. Mark, the security guard, watched from his post, his smug confidence evaporating, replaced by a cold knot of fear. The biker leader's eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the area until they locked onto Arthur. He didn't see a homeless man. He saw something else. He saw the way Arthur sat, the way he held himself despite the shivering. He saw the object of Arthur's intense, sorrowful focus. He walked directly to the bench, his heavy boots making no sound on the wet pavement. The rest of his men followed, fanning out behind him, forming a silent, imposing semicircle that effectively cut Arthur off from the rest of the world. The leader stopped in front of Arthur and slowly, deliberately, knelt down on one knee, bringing himself eye level with the seated man. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to his intimidating appearance, that it sent a shockwave through the crowd of watchers. Bikers like this didn't kneel, not for anyone. His gaze fell upon the sodden, stained flag in Arthur's hands. A flicker of recognition, then profound sadness, crossed his features. His gravelly voice was quiet, yet it carried in the charged silence. "That's Spike's flag," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Arthur looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. He stared into the face of the biker, a face that held the harsh geography of a long, hard life, and saw a glimmer of a shared history he thought was long buried. How do you know?" Arthur stammered. The biker leader pointed a leather-gloved finger at a small, almost invisible embroidered detail near the edge of the flag. A tiny, stylized pair of angel wings with a lightning bolt between them. Spike's personal mark. "He was my nephew," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "My name's Frank, but they call me Preacher. David was prospecting for our chapter before he signed up. He was a good kid. A damn good kid." Preacher looked from the flag to Arthur's face, his eyes taking in the hollow cheeks, the haunted look, the uniform-like jacket. "You're Arthur," he stated, the same certainty in his voice. "Spike wrote about you, said you were the best man in his platoon. The one he trusted with his life." He paused, his gaze hardening as he took in Arthur's condition. "His mother called us, said she hadn't heard from you in almost a year. She was worried sick. We've been looking for you, brother. We've been looking for a long time." The word brother hung in the air, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of loneliness and despair. The truth unfurled, piece by piece, for all to hear. Preacher rose to his feet and turned to his men. "This is Arthur Jensen," he announced, his voice booming across the parking lot. "He served with Spike. He was with him at the end. He's the man who brought my nephew home." A low murmur went through the ranks of the bikers. It was a sound of deep, resonant respect. They looked at Arthur now with new eyes, seeing not a victim, but a comrade, one of their own who had fallen through the cracks. They saw a soldier who had kept his promise, safeguarding the memory of their fallen brother even as his own world crumbled around him. The bikers' formation shifted. It was no longer a semicircle of intimidation, but a circle of protection. They enclosed Arthur, shielding him from the rain and the prying eyes of the crowd. One of the younger, powerfully built bikers stepped forward. He gently took the wet flag from Arthur's hands. "Let me, brother," he said softly. He walked over to Preacher's bike, the chrome engine still radiating heat, and carefully draped the flag over it, the warmth creating a small cloud of steam that rose into the gray air. It was a gesture of profound reverence. Preacher then turned his head, his gaze sweeping past the onlookers until it landed, with pinpoint accuracy, on the glass doors of the mall. He stared directly at Mark, the security guard, who was trying to make himself look small and invisible behind the safety of the glass. Preacher didn't shout. He didn't make a single threat. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, flanked by 100 silent, leather-clad men, and stared. The weight of that collective gaze was immense, a physical force that seemed to press in on the guard. Mark's face went from pale to ashen. He could feel the judgment of 100 men who lived by a code he couldn't possibly comprehend, a code of loyalty, honor, and fierce, unforgiving justice. The mall manager, a harried-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, came scrambling out, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice trembling. Preacher didn't even look at him. His eyes remained locked on Mark. Finally, Preacher broke the stare. He turned back to Arthur, who was watching the scene unfold with a dazed expression. The world had turned upside down in a matter of minutes. He had gone from being invisible to being the center of this storm of leather and steel. With a slow, deliberate movement, Preacher reached up and began to unfasten the snaps on his own vest. The coat was the most sacred object a club member owned. It represented his identity, his history, his allegiance. It was covered in patches that told the story of his life in the club. To remove it was a significant act. To give it to another was unheard of. He slid the heavy leather vest from his shoulders and, in a gesture of profound respect, draped it over Arthur's thin, shivering frame. The vest was warm from his body heat and heavy with the weight of patches and honor. It settled on Arthur's shoulders like a king's robe, covering his threadbare jacket. "No man who stood with Spike stands alone," Preacher said, his voice resonating with absolute conviction. "You're with us now, brother. Your family." Arthur looked down at the Hell's Angel patch on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the crushing weight on his soul begin to lift. He was no longer a ghost. He was seen. He was claimed. The bikers led Arthur away from the mall, two of them supporting him by the elbows as he limped. The crowd parted for them as if they were royalty, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. The mother who had offered Arthur money now hid her face, unable to meet the steady, judging gaze of the men as they passed. The mall manager was stammering apologies to Preacher's back, but the biker paid him no mind. Their business at the mall was concluded. Justice had been delivered not through violence, but through a powerful, silent display of presence and principle. They took Arthur to a small, 24-hour diner a few miles down the road, a place with worn vinyl booths and the comforting smell of coffee and frying bacon. They took the largest booth in the back, the bikers filling the surrounding tables, creating a protective perimeter. A waitress, a seasoned woman who looked like she had seen everything, took their orders without batting an eye at the intimidating clientele. She simply brought an extra-large mug of black coffee and placed it in front of Arthur. "You look like you could use this, Han," she said with a kind smile. Arthur wrapped his cold hands around the warm ceramic, the heat seeping into his bones. He took a sip, the bitter, hot liquid a balm to his soul. He sat there, in Preacher's cute, surrounded by the quiet hum of conversation from the bikers. They didn't press him with questions or overwhelm him with pity. They simply included him. They talked about bikes, about old club stories, about Spike. They shared memories of their fallen brother, laughing at his antics, their voices filled with a gruff affection. They were giving Arthur back the pieces of his friend he thought he'd lost forever. As they waited for their food, the biker who had taken the flag brought it to the table. It was dry now, and he had taken the time to fold it with military precision into a perfect tight triangle. He placed it on the table in front of Arthur. "It's clean, brother," he said. Arthur reached out and touched it, his fingers tracing the familiar stars and stripes. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek and fell onto his hand. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. The dam of stoicism he had built around his heart for years had finally broken. He belonged somewhere again. The food arrived, a massive platter of steak and eggs for Arthur, which he ate with a hunger that was years deep. As he ate, he felt the gazes of the other diner patrons on him. But for the first time, they were not looks of disgust or fear. They were looks of curiosity, of respect, of people trying to understand the incredible story that was unfolding before them. They saw a man who had been cast out by society being embraced by its most feared tribe. When the meal was over, Preacher paid the bill for everyone, leaving the waitress a tip that made her eyes go wide. They filed out of the diner and into the night. The rain had finally stopped, and the clouds had broken, revealing a sky full of stars. The wet asphalt gleamed under the streetlights, reflecting the chrome of the 100 motorcycles that stood waiting like patient warhorses. They didn't have a plan for Arthur's entire future mapped out, but they had the next step. A hot shower, a clean bed in the clubhouse, a chance to breathe, a chance to heal. As Arthur stood there, breathing in the clean, rain-washed air, Preacher put a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Spike always said you were a rock," he said. "Guess he was right. It just took your brothers a while to find you." Arthur could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He was given a helmet and a place on the back of Preacher's bike. As he settled in behind the club president, he looked back at the diner, at the faces of the ordinary people watching from the window. He saw in their expressions the profound and permanent shift he felt in his own soul. He was no longer invisible. He was a man of honor, vouched for by a brotherhood of giants. Preacher kicked the starter, and the big V-twin engine roared to life, a sound no longer menacing, but triumphant. One by one, the other engines joined in, a symphony of power and loyalty. They pulled out of the parking lot and onto the open road, 100 points of light moving as one. The sound of their passage was a promise echoing into the night, a promise that no brother is ever truly lost, and that dignity, once earned, can never be taken away. Arthur held the folded flag tight against his chest, the roar of the engine a lullaby, carrying him not just down a highway, but toward home.